This idea of how the topic of dating finds itself in Asian American culture or in our churches is that a lot of times it's almost so black and white, as if it's like a very defined line.
Mm.
If you talk to parents, it's like, don't talk about this, don't do it, focus on your studies when you're in high school or in middle school, right? But then once you get to college, it's like, hey, where's your boyfriend? Who are you going to marry? How come you're not seeing
Oh,
it? So it's a
insufferable.
weird, like fluid, but yet super subjective thing that is not related to one's maturity or a longer term milestone or even the purpose of dating.
You are listening to the Asian American Youth Ministry Roundtable, part of the Rooted family of podcasts, advancing gospel-centered youth ministry for those serving in Asian American contexts and their students, equipping those serving to more effectively disciple students, and empowering families and churches to minister to Asian American youth more faithfully.
Hey everybody, this is the Asian American Rooted Roundtable podcast. Thanks for joining us again for another couple of episodes as we're going to continue this month talking through a lot of stuff. And so my name is Justin. I'll be your host today. I got some friends, some really good friends, as we are trying to discuss a spicy yet needed topic. And so I got my friend Dorothy over here and Terrence as well. And so Dorothy, why don't you say hi? Give us a quick update of what's been going on and throw it to Terrence.
Hi, everyone. I am Dorothy, and I serve as the youth director at the Chinese Bible Church of Maryland in Rockville, Maryland. This is now going on to my seventh year almost. I am just glad to be partnering with Rooted as much as, in the last several years. The topic that we'll be talking about, like Justin said, is certainly a spicy and juicy one, and at times a little frustrating just knowing the landscape of youth ministry these days, but it's certainly one that needs to be talked about. Pass it to you, Terrence.
Hey everyone, I'm Terrence Shay. I'm the family pastor at First Chinese Baptist Church of Walnut in Southern California, and I'm starting my ninth year here, so time has really flown. And I love this topic. This was not a topic that I think when we were brainstorming that we immediately put out there, but even for right now at my church, we are doing a series that is covering this topic in particular and what is more relevant for our students and even for ourselves in the relationships that we have. So thank you so much for hosting this.
All right, thanks, guys. And so now you're wondering what in the world are we talking about today? We are going to go into the world of youth ministry and dating. And I think we'll just stay with that word at this moment because, again, maybe if you guys have enough comments and suggestions, we'll go off and talk about everything else. But we're talking about youth ministry and dating within specifically the Asian American church and context. And so it's a very preliminary conversation, but we have a lot to talk about. And so let's open with this, right? Let's go pretty broad and general. If the three of us were brainstorming this topic for our leaders and our parents and our youth groups, if we're creating a manual, right?
Whoa.
And let's call it a dating manual for Asian American youth in the church, what would some of your chapters be?
I think maybe so this is just my gut reaction. I was like, he's not worth it. I'm just like,
Ooh.
Lord forgive me. No, but maybe in all seriousness, or mostly seriousness, I would say be firm in your faith and affirmed in your identity in Christ.
Whoa.
That would be my
One more time. I'll see it.
Be firm in your faith and affirmed in your identity in Christ.
Okay. All right.
That would be the first thing. And why do I say that? Maybe, in the 20 pages recap here, hypothetical. It's because I think in many times through adolescence or like teenage years, as well as into college years, I have seen some friends and some of my older friends start dating in high school or very early on in college. And the reality of life is that sometimes those relationships don't always work out towards marriage. But the thing is, so much of a person's identity, particularly in these very raw developmental periods of adolescence life, so much of their identity and their sense of being comes from their relationships. So when a person aligns his or herself with another, especially romantically, then there's a situation where they may break up, they split. So what happens more often than not, friend groups are shifted or shattered, and a person begins to question, who am I apart from this person? And then not only do they feel many feels, but they go through this journey of trying to discover who they actually are, not just being identified as someone's girlfriend or boyfriend.
Right.
And it feels kind of crummy to start from like step one again, especially
Yeah.
if you're like a junior or senior
Yeah.
in college and you were dating someone who was 2 or 3 years older than you when you started as a freshman in college, right?
Right. Right.
So I think that's the big thing is be established in your faith and affirmed in your identity in Christ so that you're not looking to someone else to tell you who you are or what you believe. And there's more robustness to understanding who you are and what your worth is, more than aligning yourself or identifying yourself in the worth of how someone else sees you.
Right. And I would say with the identity key question is that's what we've been talking about since day one, whether it's
Mhm.
about dating or anything else. It's especially for students. And again, if you're a pastor here or leader, parents, and we're thinking about this, identity is one of the key questions that every student is asking. Who am I? That is the question of trying to figure out the identity issue prior to adding on a whole nother identifier when
Mhm.
it comes to somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend, these type of
So maybe
things.
at the end of the chapter, then I would say he's not worth it, you know?
Oh, it's true. It's
We are thrilled to announce Rooted's new book with New Growth Press, The Jesus I Wish I Knew in High School, Asian American Edition. Being a teenager is itself an overwhelming experience, but the struggles unique to Asian American teenagers can often lead them to wonder if anyone truly knows what they're going through. In this book, 12 authors come alongside Asian American students to share their own high school experiences, helping students to see how Jesus makes a difference in our unique struggles. Jesus sees them and knows them fully. These testimonies of growing up Asian American include struggles with belonging, performance pressure, fear of failure, living in an honor-shame culture, eating disorders, sexual assault, and adoption. The writers now walk faithfully with Jesus in their ethnic and cultural distinctions. These stories lift up the Asian American experience with dignity, offering representation and belonging. We hope you'll read this book and share it with the Asian American teenagers in your home or church.
okay. Well, Terrence, how do you have another additional chapter that you would put before or after Dorothy's?
I would put it maybe next to Dorothy's,
He's
but
not
this
worth it right
I
now.
would put it just as something that's gives the potential to be unpacked if this is chapter one. And so I would just give the title, Dating is for Marriage, Not for Yourself.
Okay.
And so from there, there's the opportunity to kind of unpack what marriage is and the purpose then of how dating is not the end all of anything or a means by which you are measured in a snapshot of a season of your life of your worth or anything else. It's got a long view in your life. So you got to keep that in mind. And that's a part of even ascertaining whether you're ready or not, or it's wise or not. But then the second part, it's not for yourself, which means it's not for your feelings. It's not for your own happiness or you think will make you happy. It's not for your standing. It's not for your, place amongst your friend groups. It's even not for what people think of you. So dating is for marriage, not for yourself would be my first chapter title.
How would you, okay, so in that chapter, and Dorothy, you can help me out of this. In that chapter, Terrence, like, how do you explain that, say, to a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, when, you know what I mean? Like, hey,
Right.
this is
Yeah.
just without any framework. Let's just say they're even somewhat new to church world. Like, where would you go with that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that, and this maybe connects to another topic that we could explore a little bit, it's the idea of how the topic of dating finds itself in Asian American culture or in our churches. Is that a lot of times it's almost so black and white, as if it's like a very defined line. If you talk to parents, it's like, don't talk about this, don't do it, focus on your studies when you're in high school or in middle school, right? But then once you get to college, it's like, hey, where's your boyfriend? Who are you going to marry? How come you're not seeing it? So it's a
Insufferable.
weird, like fluid, but yet super subjective thing that is not related to one's maturity or a longer term milestone or even the purpose of dating. And I think that's the reason why our students get confused, because if it's like all or nothing with no explanation and with no exploring of like the reason for it and the purpose for it contextualized for our time, then either they're going to never do it, but then not grow into what it means and is supposed to be about and just ignore it, but then be confronted with it at a later time and have no idea how to approach it, or they're just going to disobey, they're going to rebel and just do whatever it is behind the parents' back or behind the pastor's back, and then make all kinds of mistakes, but then feel so shamed that they can't bring up their struggles and issues at church.
Yeah.
And so I just want to be able to focus on the big picture, not to say you can't date or you shouldn't date. It's not a black or white thing, but it's to give them like a view of a future that God has created for his image bearers, many of us, to aspire towards, which is marriage.
Right.
And then in our culture, dating has a place in that can be helpful, that can make sense. But then, you know what? If you're so far away from being married, you're 10 years old, you're not even an adult for 8 years. I mean, that ties into, well, what does it mean to be responsible? What does it mean to be a spouse? What does it mean, to be a leader? What does it mean to provide in different ways, and to be mature enough to handle various aspects of marriage? Well, then you really have to think, should you date at all? Is this even possible? Is this even meaningful?
Yeah.
And so when you have like a bigger goal, I feel like it actually helps to frame the conversation better, to explore the hearts of our students.
Right. And at this point, I could only imagine a lot of churches in general, or parachurch organizations, they're really trying to still deal with this question. For the three of us, how has our churches, especially in the Asian American context, how have you seen it worked out? Was it a good experience? Was it tough? And then, like, to Terrence's point, like, was it just kind of on the polls, right? Like, hey, don't do it, or yeah, it doesn't matter, or whatever.
I mean, I will say that having grown up in a period of purity culture, I think it's
We don't want to timestamp you, but okay, we get it.
I think those elements and complexities are still unraveling, even for many who are among my generation, and some of like some students who are in very, very theologically and culturally conservative communities now. I think that excuse me, to use ownership language, I have seen the intersection, or, the honestly, just the intricacies of culture and faith as it relates to dating, and such that, particularly in Asian culture, it's one of conformity. And so by that, in the most basic sense, it's like addressing whether or not a student is dating a Christian. And I have seen in the past, and also in my current context, where, like, having grown up in a Chinatown church, dating a non-Christian is actually kind of normalized. At least it was when I was growing up as a teen. Not to say that it was encouraged, but it was normalized in that these phenomenons will happen. They are not relationships that were believed to bring about the greater outcome of marriage, but I do see that there are some who ended up getting married. They met in the church. They were both rooted in the faith, and perhaps later down the line, they may be more nominal than they are committed to Christ and his church. But the aspect of conformity is such that if you were perhaps to date a non-Christian, you might be excluded, whether intentionally or unintentionally, from other friend group hangouts. Maybe there were aunties and uncles who knew too much about your business and you never told them about it. And that may continue to today, right? Too much WeChat and these WhatsApp groups talking about so-and-so's relationship because they're trying to set someone up. Whether you're a student or an adult, I think sometimes there are good intentions, but execution sometimes is lacking boundaries. Or even that some people, they may be dating non-Christians or Christians, but they just want to keep it on the DL because they don't want unnecessary involvement from other parties that are not actually accountable for the relationship. So there's a lot of different angles, I think, from which to look at. But more importantly, I do agree with Terrence that perhaps one of the early chapters to this hypothetical dating handbook for youth in the church is dating is for marriage. But a caveat I would say is that also assumes that the student is following Christ and wants to have God-honoring relationships. And I know of some previous students who have said, I met this guy, but he's not a Christian, but I think that I can convert him. I'm like,
Right.
Honey, no, don't evangel date, don't missionary date.
Right.
It's like, if you want to show the gospel to him, you can do that as a friend. But then if he will only talk to you if you're in a relationship, that's already a big red flag. But we can only walk students through things, but we can't make the decisions for them.
I think as we talk about this topic, right, and as we continue to have future conversations, this is where the church comes in as a key part of our dating experience, or even just how we talk about it. Because again, we're coming from a place of, how does the gospel speak into this very unique but very important part of our development, right? And whether we're going to date at that moment or in the future, because I mean, we could talk about when do you do it and at what age or whatever, but I think it's the church that comes around. Do you have faithful pastors and ministers and leaders that you trust to not only speak words of wisdom, but to point you back to the gospel and these type of things? And so, especially for Asian churches, I think we definitely need to be more vulnerable in talking about these things. But again, not just wait till once a year to talk about these things, but constantly. This is as we mature together. How do we bring ourselves to the foot of the cross, to each other, bear each other's burdens as we struggle through this topic? And so I know we can go on forever because this would be a massive book and manual. Any last words on this topic?
We just need the church to be a place where you can talk about this as a topic without feeling judged. I mean, there's so much that the Bible has to say as it relates to who we are as image bearers, of who we are in terms of how we're made to be people with feelings, people that desire relationships. And there's so much that could be unpacked that actually points our students towards their gospel identity. But a lot of times we just don't want to address it. We don't want to talk about it. And so it gets talked about anyway, but just in all the ways in which it is not helpful or necessarily directed towards God's will or what is ultimately good and would help with our own, flourishing and joy. So yes, don't talk about just once a year, but definitely I think sometimes having those milestones intentionally put into your teaching calendar makes it so that your students understand that you don't get by a year without talking about relationships, without talking about, sex, gender, any of these things that are the things that culture is constantly bombarding you with, how you should think, who you should be, what you should want. You're going to talk about it regularly so that you could talk about it whenever. So just to bring it into the open is so important. And so oftentimes the parents' generation, they just avoid the topic. And even if they bring up the topic, sometimes it's more about prohibitions than it is about positive gospel-centered aspirations. Right. You're going to be able to help people to pursue what is better when you're actually able to point them to what is good. And so just be able to address the issue intentionally is so important.
Yeah, I mean, another last thought, and Terrence, I was definitely a point where it's always a matter of redirection, not just correction or prohibition or what's allowed and what's not. I would say in some ways there are other more pressing topics that have been highlighted in this day and age, like mental health, depression, anxiety, and loneliness. And so perhaps that's one reason why dating could be talked about, but other things seem to be needed to be talked about with more urgency. That doesn't negate that we shouldn't, should or shouldn't talk about dating, but for sure, it's always important for students to be aware of their motivations as they go into dating and the boundaries that they learn and are able to implement when they go into dating. I think this is also how students learn a lot about themselves and what they actually believe and what accountability looks like in the most basic sense, both for faith and for their relationships. And so this is such a ripe and unique position for us to see how, again, we're not the ones who are making our students' decisions, but we can counsel them, we can walk with them, but we can also be accessible when things happen in a way that they didn't anticipate or perceive or hope for. And it's not to say, I told you so, but you could say, we talked about this, but tell me more of how I can encourage you or to walk with you. And those are the most, like you said, vulnerable times for us to be pastoral and to shepherd our students in light of any of the decisions that they make and what happens after that. So I'll turn it back over to you, Justin.
Thanks, guys. I mean, there's a lot of great wisdom here. If you're ministering to students or if you are one yourself, just continue to There's a lot of good resources out now, podcasts, books, videos. And so first and foremost, ask your pastor who you trust for some resources. They will have tons to share with you. We also have a couple we'll throw in the show notes after this episode. Thank you for deep diving with us, shallow diving with us in this topic. We got a lot more later. I know the narratives are going to be huge at the time of dropping this podcast. And so stay grounded and rooted in the gospel. But until then, thank you guys for listening to the Rooted Asian American Youth Ministry Roundtable. We look forward to the next time we chat. Until then, may the Lord bless you. And we trust that Christ will transform you. And so in the meantime, be sure to follow us on the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also find us on Instagram at The Rooted Ministry. Until then, we'll talk to you soon. All right, see ya.
Thank you for listening to the Asian American Youth Ministry Roundtable, part of the Rooted family of podcasts. You can go even deeper into gospel-centered, Bible-saturated youth ministry by listening to our other podcasts, including the Rooted Youth Ministry Podcast and the Rooted Parent Podcast. Find them all at rootedministry.com.
Join us for our first ever Asian American Youth Worker Training Day, where we'll explore the topics that bridge the gap between the heart, hands, and head of Asian American youth ministry. Our hope is to encourage, empower, and equip youth workers in the distinct and unique trenches of Asian American youth ministry, culture, language, and multiple congregations, etc. What will set this training day apart from any other youth ministry training conference is having the content and teaching set to the unique context of Asian American youth ministry. No more wondering how we'll implement these practices and strategies to our context, or getting discouraged that what we learn, we can't do these things in the way we're told we ought to. We're going to think about the heart of youth ministry, be encouraged by plenary speakers who together have over 50 years of youth ministry experience, and workshops that offer training and insights into the heart issues for youth ministry to Asian American churches and teenagers. We're going to think about the hands, attend workshops that offer practical training and equip you with skills that are essential for youth ministry. Finally, we're going to think about the head, be a part of the larger discussion on the direction of Asian American youth ministry and where it's headed. We believe sincerely at Rooted Ministry and Sola Network that Jesus loves and has gifted Asian American youth workers in their churches to reach students we're called to. We want to help come alongside you, and we hope that you'll meet new youth ministry friends through this day together. Register now. The conference is for all youth workers, pastors, volunteers, and teachers, etc.